Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks for connecting and welcome to the Geneva Macro Labs online talk. My name is Renate Günther, and I have the pleasure to be one of the co-founders of the Geneva Macro Labs do tank. I will be moderating this online talk together with my colleague, Dr. Marianne Schörling. She's our head of stakeholder engagement, and she will be chairing the Q&A. This webinar will be recorded, so kindly switch off your camera if you don't want to appear on the video, and please mute yourself if you are not presenting. For those of you who don't know the Geneva Macro Labs yet, we are a do tank that scales the Lake Geneva area's intellectual potential and brings leading minds together to support the sustainable development goals out of Switzerland. You find more information on our website, gemlabs.ch. We recently launched our Impact Labs initiative to reflect the aspect of a do tank, where we enable sustainable projects with the help of collective intelligence of our community. If you want to support us, please find the link to our survey in the chat box. So what's on the agenda today? We will talk about a sustainable future, how to drive value without impact washing. You might have seen there was a recent report of the UN that warns that there's a pressing need to reshape global production networks to be more green, inclusive, and sustainable. And those who attended our webinar last week might remember that we discussed that COVID-19 has disrupted globalization, and over the next years we will be putting it back together. It's an opportunity to better include that segments of the society who couldn't benefit from globalization as we know it. It's also a chance for alternative globalization to deliver on climate action. The UN report says that the crisis can be a catalyst for new, more resilient production networks based on value chains that are shorter, more regional, sustainable, and digital. I'm delighted to welcome two experts on this topic today. The first one will be Sonja Haut from Novartis, who will speak about how to measure impact projects. And her co-speaker, Walid Saqqaf from Insureblocks, who will introduce a concrete impact project impacting by valuing natural capital. After the presentations, we will have the usual Q&A session, and I already look forward to your questions. Please post them in the chat box, and kindly also let us know already now where you are located so that we can understand how international our audience is. I have the pleasure to introduce our first speaker now. Sonja Haut, she has worked on impact valuation for Novartis since 2015, as head of strategic measurement and materiality since 2019. Previously, she served as head of group reporting systems development in Novartis Finance, launching and implementing reporting processes for group functions. She joined the Novartis Pharma division in 2001 as a leader in IT. Sonja earned an MBA from IMD Lausanne and holds degrees in physics and mathematics from the University of Freiburg. Sonja, may I ask you to unmute yourself and help us understand better why impact needs to be measured and why valuing it is key. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Renate, and a very warm welcome to all of you as you join us this evening or afternoon, as I've seen someone joining from Massachusetts. You may have seen Novartis issuing a sustainability bond on 1.85 billion euros in September, the first of its kind relating targets to access to medicines into the bond targets. Also before, we've been issuing our quite ambitious environmental sustainability targets on being totally carbon neutral and a few others until the end of the decade, including our full supply chain. In the Q3 press release that has gone out recently, we clearly made it clear that ESG parameters are part of the strategy. And this is all on the backdrop of Novartis committed to knowing its economic, environmental, and social impacts of its business operations on environment, the societies, and the communities in which we're operating. In my mind, impact valuation is the winning response to a number of those macro trends that see ESG topics on the rise, as we measure and look at impacts that can be positive and negative and really comprise all aspects of business, they're highly indicative of how ESG strategies can be informed. I've said now impacts already a few times, and Renate has mentioned the word a few times in her intro. It is just no longer good enough to measure inputs and outputs. We do have to move to outcomes and ideally impacts and measure them. We take that to the next level of valuing impacts for all the stakeholder groups we consider. And in these monetary version of impact valuation, the insights become comparable and thus useful for business and decisions. Renate also mentioned that we're on this for 5 years, and the background of this is, as a research company, we'd like to explore and test the waters and learn as we go. So it was a very explorative start when we set out to test ideas around impact valuation in 2 markets, in Kenya and in China. And the guiding questions were around, ideally the readouts would support business decisions, but they should also be meaningful for stakeholders and help us engage in a dialogue that is not driven by a dichotomy of us and them, but really helps to establish a common view on the environment, on trends, on things that are happening and relevant to the company and to its stakeholders. And another one was on feasibility. I mean, it all sounds great, right? You should measure your impact and know it, but then can you do it? And what does it take to do it? So we were quite pleased that the readouts were positive, that it was possible to do it and to not only do it, but scale it rapidly across the company. Here, I need to say that the theme was launched out of the finance function, and from that background it was clear that we had to actually utilize globally standardized databases within the company to the extent ever possible. Otherwise that would have just led to an additional reporting burden on the company. Now, there is an increased demand from asset managers, from other drivers on non-financial information, and that's because, in my mind, classical financial data just does not explain anymore the true company value and the true value creation story. So depending on who you ask and which statistics you use and which companies you use as sample, but in the 1990s, most of the company value was largely explained by companies' balance sheets, and the value that you saw in market cap was represented there. And in the meantime, that ratio is reversed, where most of the value in terms of market capitalization cannot be traced back to the balance sheet anymore. So the question is, what is this driven by? And you know very well, as I see you sitting here, and with the warm introduction you got from Renate with a personalized welcome, I assume you all know very well companies that have been more or less loss-making in most quarters and still have a huge market cap because they sell the idea to contribute to a better future for all. So in some ways, ESG has gained a market value, right? And it's no longer about doing the right thing or signaling that you do the right thing, but it's really about acting that way as well. So that's the rise of impact investing, and this is at an interesting point in time whereby investors do no longer seek to just avoid harm and be profitable at the same time. It's really more than that. Investors now more and more look towards helping to solve global challenges, helping to resolve the crisis at hand, climate change, of course, increasing equality, or any of the other sustainable development goals. Now, this is driven by customer preferences that change, and you will also be aware that more wealth than ever is about to be passed on from the baby boomers to the next generation. And this new generation, these new owners of wealth, do come with the aspiration that they want to invest that money for the greater good of people and the planet. So I found that highly interesting that in a recent summary by the WEF around the 5 megatrends you need to be aware of, citizen action was labeled as one of the 5. The other one, climate warming, rising sea levels, green energy, and one more. Another one around nature. Starting point was it matters what it needs to. It needs to be about measuring what matters to stakeholders, because we need to measure, otherwise things don't get done in business. So it's no longer to measure enough to measure just inputs and outputs. We need to move beyond. We need to move to outcomes and impacts. And well, I'm not sure whether it's worth illustrating this to this group, as from Renate's clues, I got you're also well into that. Let me still do it. So with an everyday example of a toothbrush producer, the notion of inputs and outputs would largely represent their P&L. It would be, what are the costs to the company to produce the toothbrushes? What were the outputs? How much of those products did they sell? But actually, what delivers an outcome is how often were they used, and actually these outcomes are a starting point. What one should be interested in is an improved health situation and what people can do with their lives thanks to that improved health situation. So apologies for the simple example, but as this notion of inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts is a bit technical, I felt it's worth at least establishing what my understanding is of that situation. So for 3 consecutive years, we've been publishing our impact valuation statements according to what's referred to as financial, environmental, and social impacts, revealing in the meantime, now that we're capable of capturing these, that the largest impact by far is in the social impact of our products. That shouldn't be surprising. It's in line with actually the assessment of large institutions like the Access to Medicines Foundation that places the most material issue for the entire industry in providing access and furthering and extending people's lives through precisely that mechanism. So, but I mean, one of the realizations that maybe has become clearer through that unfortunate bastard of a COVID crisis is that health and wealth and the environment are all interrelated. So healthy people require a healthy planet, otherwise they don't stay healthy. And this is particularly true in vulnerable settings. So the decision to consider social impacts next to the environmental aspects is helping the joint view whereby we try and see the interlinkages. And clearly it's an evolving practice. It's not perfect. It's based on assumptions, but what it does do, it instills a solid dialogue internally and externally. And I feel that daring to be transparent and communicate differently with the negatives alongside the positives but centered around a purpose, just helps to have a totally improved way of actually living up to the company's purpose. Now I'm rolling back one step, that is around how did we select the indicators to look after in the absence of an established sustainability standards. Hey, great news, by the way, on the IARC and SASB joining forces. And that news came out today. So a great news here, but still there's no established standard. So in the absence of the sustainability equivalent of IFRS or the like, we utilize our own framework of materiality assessments to identify the indicators. And so we've been active with materiality assessments since 2006. We have on a global level a 4-year cycle whereby we review these items and test our stakeholders, actually an ever-growing base of stakeholders, against their preferences and how they see us perform. That helps us to get a profile on where those needs are to actually excel, improve, and also where the differences to our own perception. We use the same questionnaire to internal stakeholders, and that's quite insightful on how the external stakeholders judge on certain of these 30 issues grouped in 8 issue clusters, and how we ourselves think we're doing. So we derived these indicators, and actually, Renate or Marianne, how do we go about timing? Do you somehow indicate how many minutes I have left, or?
Yeah, I think we are coming slowly to an end.
All right. So we screened these these 30 issue clusters for indicators, and out came indicators around GDP contribution and employment. In the economic side, it was about climate change, CO2 emissions, other air emissions, particulate matter, SOx, NOx, all of these, water waste, the environmental area, and the social impact of occupational safety, employee development, and living wages. And of course, as I just mentioned, our medicines and products. Now, having gone through that thought process and the practice, turns out that most of these, looking at own operations and the entire supply chain, are absolutely universal. So maybe our values, so that the results may differ, but actually the indicators themselves, as just taking the topic of fair pay, as every company employs people, the notion of the social impact of salary and wages is quite universal, and there's nothing unique to the pharmaceutical industry or to Novartis. So with that spirit, we've formed the Value Balancing Alliance with other companies, with also the big 4 consultancies, to try and standardize what's out there and compare and contrast notes to get to conclusions on what could be taken forward with a common standard around this, with the understanding that any adoption by other private sector players will only be easily possible if we have a standard. And then also it's a lot easier for other players to pick up signals coming from the private sector, from governments, from supranational institutions, but also from investors once standardization is there. And well, let me conclude here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonja, for this very interesting presentation. So I understand companies cannot no longer just do this usual sustainability cosmetics. It has to be in the DNA, and the products and services have to show it. And also, it's a new generation of the millennials want to invest into good companies. They want to invest into the right shares and financial market securities. So investors are also somehow obliged to provide this kind of securities. And also, it's very interesting what you are doing with the Value Balancing Alliances, that you are trying to set up ESG standards, because that's what we need in order not to compare peers and apples when it comes to investment, for example. Thank you very much, Anja, and I look forward to further discussing during the Q&A. You can already post your questions in the chat box. I now want to introduce our next speaker. Walid Al-Saqqaf is the founder of Insureblocks, the leading blockchain educational podcast and boutique consultancy firm that supports companies and industry turn into digital natives. Walid started off in the corporate world at Barclays Corporate Banking in 1998. As a serial entrepreneur, he has co-founded 5 startups, of which 1 had a successful acquisition. His last corporate experience was an in-house entrepreneur and head of blockchain at the Lloyd's specialist insurer Beazley. Walid is an industry associate in the UCL Center for Blockchain Technologies. Walid, kindly unmute yourself and let us know more about your impact project that focuses on the valuation of natural capital and the elements needed to design and implement a multi-stakeholder approach. Walid, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Renate, and thank you, Marianne and Eckhart, for the opportunity. Sonja, I loved your presentation, and it's great to hear, how forward-thinking Novartis is. So brilliant. So let me move on straight to my slide. So talking about valuation, right? One of your previous speaker on the Geneva Macro Labs was Ralph Chamy, who is the assistant director at the IMF, who actually valued the carbon sequestration and carbon capture services an African forest elephant provides. And guess what? It's $1.75 million, which is a lot more than the $40,000 its tusks are worth. The difference between the two is that we have a market for a dead creature, but we do not have a market for a living creature, which is, sorry to say, totally absurd. So based on that kind of incredible valuation work that Ralph has done on how much a living elephant is responsible for in terms of carbon capture and carbon sequestration, I decided to use my knowledge of blockchain to say we can create a market around this. And so I partnered with Ralph, and also partnered with the well-known conservationist Ian Redmond, who describes the African forest elephant as the great gardeners of the rainforest. And I've lost the slides. So until the slides come back. So what we've decided to do is to be able to, as I say, to build this market where we can, bring that valuation that Ralph has built, so that we can bring enterprise into it. But so we created a vision, and our vision is to build a resilient, equitable, and sustainable economy underpinned by a regenerative nature and thriving local communities. So there are three key words here. If you could go on to the next slide, please. Colors are very different. Sorry, apologies for that. There are three key words: prosperous economy, regenerative nature, and thriving communities. Why are these three key words? Because too long we've associated with the fact that if you want a thriving economy, it's going to mean killing nature. If you want to protect nature, it means killing the economy. Kind of makes you remember the kind of Trump messages we've been hearing for the last year. But unfortunately, it has been a thought that has been underlining in the Western world. And we believe you can do all three at the same time. And this is what our market is trying to do. So we believe in for change, which is transforming carbon exchange markets into a driving force for good and bringing transparency, traceability, and trust to them. For those of you who do not know it, existing carbon exchange markets are murky, they're dark, and they're full of middlemen who've got one only objective, which is to make more money for themselves. We ourselves, we're going to be a for-profit organization. We're not a charity, because we believe that for-profit organizations have the focus, and where all our profits are reinvested back into identifying future opportunities to regenerate nature, raise living standards, whilst growing our economies. And I'll be explaining how that works. If you could please move to the next slide. Thank you. So there's three components. One is the engine is using the carbon exchange markets by enabling firms to offset their carbon emissions. That feeds into what we call regenerative of nature, because where do these funds go? They go into the living assets, such as the African forest elephant, who does all the services in terms of capture of the carbon and sequestration. What is key here, we're not privatizing animals. We're simply paying for the services they've been doing every day of their lives. And the third final component is regenerative of communities. How can you enable local communities to prosper and to grow through this? If you could please go to the next slide. So this is what I'm talking about. It's local communities where you respond. The funds go to rangers who are here to take care of the elephants, but also, unfortunately, to protect them. A lot of the poachers are actually professionally organized gangs, put it bluntly, and they come heavily armed. But a lot of the carbon emissions is also to go and support local communities through investment programs, such as building schools, buying solar panels, building wells, all these kind of services. Next slide, please. But to achieve that, just keep clicking on until you see a big image. We've managed to create a multidisciplinary approach to this complex problem. This problem cannot be resolved through science, through technology, or through lawyers. It cannot be resolved by only that field. It has to be multidisciplinary. And I'm not a conservationist. I'm not really a technologist. I'm just a startup guy. But we managed, by bringing this collection of 30 volunteers, and it's growing every day, to come and tackle this problem. And you can see all these beautiful faces in that image. And so we got people from academia, we got scientists, we got economists, entrepreneurs, technologists, students, lawyers, marketeers, financiers. And they come from all around the world, from Europe, from the Americas, from Haiti, from South Africa, from India. And it's growing, the kind of presence we have. Next slide, please. So yeah, just keep clicking, because else it's going to be difficult to explain. So the way this works is that you have an enterprise. Let's say Apple. They want to offset their carbon emissions. They say, I want to offset, X metric tons of carbon over the next 2 years. Our system checks how many elephants do we have on our system that are available, that are not being served, they're not being paid for another company, who are of a certain age and a certain location, who can capture that service. Once we've identified that we have enough elephants to do that for that 2 years, then Apple, for example, will send $1 million into an escrow account. Keep clicking, please. Now, we need to verify that A, the animal is alive, and B, that the animal is still in the forest and not in a zoo. So we have sensors that will put it in a non-intrusive way on the animal. And we're playing with different concepts. One idea is that a sensor can monitor the heartbeat of the animal. Why? Because every creature on Earth has a unique heartbeat. That's our digital signature. So we know it's not somebody pretending to be an elephant or whatever. So every time at the end of the day, we get a message from the sensor that says, hey, I'm alive and I'm still in the forest, the smart contract will issue a token that is backed by the money that sits in the escrow account. That token goes into the ranger's mobile phone. You've been paid. It goes into providing micro investments where the local community decides how they wish to invest that money. Those tokens are spent at in grocery shops. They're spent at utility companies, at schools. And at the end of the week or at the end of the months, each of the tokens are sent back to us. And then we send the cash to those organizations. That avoids the problem of having to carry cash. It avoids a whole range of problems. But what does it give Apple? It gives Apple the ability to offset their carbon emissions in a transparent, traceable, and trusted manner. This is all in the blockchain. It's all accessible. Number two, they can see how their funds are being used. They say, I've provided full-time employment to X number of rangers. $1.75 million, that's equal to $80 a day over 60 years. You can do a lot of money with that, especially when you look at a tribe of elephants of 5 or 10. And Apple can see that, you know what? I've helped this local community buy solar panels. They now have electricity, or build a well. They now have water. That's it. You get a corporate social responsibility message that comes from offsetting your carbon emissions. If you go to the next slide, please. So effectively, what we're doing is that we're taking this toxic asset of carbon and we're transforming it into carbon for social good. That's what we're looking to do. And that's it.
Thank you, Walid. That's fascinating. And I'm really proud that we had the chance to have Raif Sharmi from the IMF at our Davos event earlier this year, where he introduced already the whale, let's say, concept. And it's fascinating to really benefit from a living body of an animal, because it's animals like whales or elephants, they are capturing emissions, they are reducing CO2 in the universe. And that's a fascinating, let's say, strategy. And to then also, connecting it to tokens and to the blockchain world and investors who want to benefit from that. Thank you very much, Walid. I now want to hand over to Marianne. Marianne, there are already quite some questions in the chat box. Please, you have the floor to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Renate, and also thank you, Walid and Sonja, for your presentation. Now, the opening question when we advertised today's webinar was around what does it really take to achieve a sustainable future for all? I would say it's quite a complex question that covers many different aspects, from multilateralism, which we discussed last week, to business ethics and governance, to the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and much more. So what I would like now to do is, before I give the floor to our today's webinar community, I would like to take up the first theme that I could see in both presentations, which was about the adoption of sustainability as a governance tool. And let me first address the first question to you, Sonja. It seems that we have entered a time where more and more actors are trying to understand the linkage between investment performance and social impact. And as you have worked on impact valuation since many years, you have developed the financial, environmental, and social impact valuation approach at Novartis and co-authored several impact case studies. Some companies have integrated sustainability into their corporate culture. And you have mentioned customer pressure today as a component, but what's the big picture? Is sustainability still a nice to have? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Actually, it's interesting in that this entire movement on sustainability and ESG has already felt close to a tipping point last year, and my impression is it still feels like we're in front of a tipping point and not yet beyond. But clearly, to your concrete question, I would say it's the pressure is building up. When, say, to just use a prominent example, in 2018, the CEO BlackRock January letter talked vaguely about, hey, there are stakeholders, not just shareholders. And then the year after, it was in 2019, it was about our purpose. If you can't explain us what you're here for, then we don't like to invest in you that much anymore. And 2020, this has become hugely concrete with a request to disclose according to the TCFD and disclose according to SASB. So there's a move from nice to have to a need to do, very clearly.
Thank you. Let me do an introduction question to Walid as well. You have introduced to us your initiative, and I remember that a couple of weeks ago we have read in The Guardian in an article that banks lent $2.6 trillion linked to ecosystem and wildlife destruction in 2019. And the analysis outlined that the finance industry is literally bankrolling nature's destruction. So how would you say that your solution, your initiative, is not creating impact washing?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And the thing is, at the end of the day, there are two facts. One, there's always going to be bad actors within financial organizations, right? And that's nothing we can do about it. It's not unique to financial organizations. It's just something that happens. But equally, these same organizations have to report their climate-related risks. For example, a recent law in New Zealand forces all financial institutions to disclose their climate-related risks in line with the Global Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. If you're disclosing that kind of information, then your next step will be to mitigate it. And that's where I believe our platform will come in. So our platform is not going to be the answer to everything. I think the work, for example, that Sonja is doing, if that's going to be embraced by other organizations around the world, will contribute to avoid this impact washing. And of course, it's us, all of us, the consumers. We have a voice. We need to use it more often.
Okay, thank you. That was a very precise answer, and that kind of brings us right into the question of impact measurement. And I can see that our participant Michael has asked a question to Sonja, which is about impact data. Michael, would you like to address your question directly to Sonja?
Yeah. So Sonja, thanks for that. Thanks for your presentation. Yeah, it's just really around the measurement of the impacts. It's obviously it's a very difficult area, I would have thought. And I mean, how did you do it, or how are Novartis doing it? You mentioned financial systems that are there, that at least the finance department is managing it. But what systems are being used is number one question. And then number two, how do you know the result in certain of the metrics is good, bad, or indifferent?
Yeah, all good and valid points, and data is of course key, and data availability and granularity of data is of course a big one. Now, for a company like ours, there are certain elements of standardized data elements within the company, and next to finance, that's certainly HR, it's procurement, and so supply chain elements, just to capture a prominent one. And because it also cuts across several impact areas. Supply chain effects can be estimated using input-output databases through statistical means, and what you need is the consumption pattern of the company by knowing the third-party spend by sector and by country, and then the rest becomes, well, a computer problem or a technical modeling problem for a PhD in macroeconomics. So these results would then be estimates. So it's statistics. So you still don't know how an individual vendor and their vendors would actually perform, but it would provide a starting point, and you can articulate the statistics to an extent that actually you can isolate individual vendors as well. And then you have, again, a statistical statement on them, and it's a starting point. Then how well are you doing? That would of course be best answered with a benchmark. Everybody craves for benchmarks, and then for benchmarks you need many other companies to do the same thing, right? We're not there. There are, of course, ESG ratings, rankings, indices providers. And on that one, though, there's an interesting paper by Judith Ströhle and Bob Eccles last year before, on the social origins of ESG metrics, whereby the framing of these ranking indices was shown to be dependent on the social origins of the producers and on the need for those producers to actually capture a unique market position. So, so there is currently no objectivity. This is why we need standards. Standards can be market-led. Standards can come from regulators. Ideally, in my mind, it would come from a collaborative approach across all these areas, because then the policymakers would have a better view on that their policies actually have the effects that they strive for.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Sonja.
Thank you, Sonja. And maybe we can elaborate on that a little bit more. I can see that our colleague Daniel has posted a question around the possibility to measure and value social impact. Daniel, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much to both presenters for excellent presentations. My question went to Sonja, and I think you have partially answered it, but let me nag you a little bit more. I said that we have shareholder value as a principle at the moment, and one advantage is that it's relatively easy to measure. So we have the capital markets that do a relatively good job in evaluating the future cash flows of companies, and so you can tie that easily to, for example, CEO compensation and so on. So if you want to move now to social impacts, I think this becomes very complicated. At the moment, you said you kind of determine your own standards. I think that's a good first step. You say CO2 emissions are important, or maybe you know, how many people in the company receive social protection and so on. But you said, okay, we need international standards, but who is going to come up with these standards? And isn't it, I mean, are we on the social area, are we not entering too many trade-offs, you know, high employability, health covering of of, for example, health insurance of the employees, good salaries, and so on. So there's a whole bunch of things that you could say this is a social impact. We create many jobs. And I'm wondering how you, how you can come up with standards that then apply to all companies. Is that possible? And how do we get an enforcement mechanism? Because on the capital markets, you can say you have the valuation of the company, but so just if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to, Daniel. And well, might all be totally distorted because I'm a mad optimist and believe it's possible. But I mean, to start off with, I'm an adamant arguer in favor of putting employment impacts as economic impacts. To me, they are not social, and just creating jobs is also economic. It's not social. And that's why I was really glad that actually another member of the Impact Valuation Roundtable, Nestle, had explored the topic of the social impact of living wages, and they had done so for 2 countries and explored that at a conference. And what we've done at Novartis is we've scaled this globally and actually shared the resulting data sets and thresholds. It's been a development together with Valuing Nature. And it's still online, and there's a white paper on that, whereby I believe to just start with an easy topic, an easy proxy on fair pay or the notion of social impacts of employment. There's of course the entire human rights dimension, and it becomes then not everything is so immediately measurable, but salaries provide a nice objectivity. But then there's a correlation between the level of salaries, and it's explored that low salaries below a living wage, and living wage is already minimum wage plus small allowances, then allow children to go to school and have some money left to actually plan for, to actually have to plan for some unforeseen events. But then if salaries are below that level, then there are health issues correlating with that, in that treatment-seeking behavior changes, of course, even more dramatically as people are maybe busy with double jobs or just can't afford going and see a doctor. I mean, there's of course also the topic of self-paying markets versus other, but you see a health correlation in that the lower the salaries are, the health utility starts to become negative, and on the positive side, this wears off at some point. At some point of around about 4 times the living wage, you just get to enjoy a nicer life, but not more health. But what it enables is for people to look after themselves and ensure that they're really back to full health when they return to work, instead of carrying on an inflammation or whatever the case may be. So we've used that and actually equated that notion of health utility to disability adjusted life years, and then utilize the valuation of these. But I can actually quickly dig out the link to the page where that's published. And that's just one starting point. So yes, I absolutely believe that be standardizable if people agree that jobs are actually an economic effect, and that paying a salary in and by itself is just a line in the income statement and not yet social impact. Yeah, on the question on who could do it, you had another question on who could do that. I would hope that at some point, truly standard setters, but also supranational communities, the OECD, the EU, will pick this up, and drivers on the private sector side are certainly the Capitalist Coalition, the Value Balancing Alliance, where we seek to expand our current scope on standardization. And in my mind, that social impact of wages and salaries is a very obvious one to pick.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sonja. That's very enlightening. In particular, you mentioned as well in the chat, talked about systems change, and me being a sociologist, I can see that the systemic change is a prerequisite that we can actually get there, and having more people, more actors involved in introducing a new approach to sustainability and to impact valuation. And that kind of is the link to Walid, your initiative. We can see in the chat that we have a couple of questions that are talking about the implementation of new technology, in your case, blockchain, which is as well a lever for systemic change. Jörn, you have raised a question in the chat about blockchain usage in that particular initiative. Would you like to rephrase your question?
Yeah, we are already busy discussing it in the chat.
Yeah, I can see.
And I think, well, taking the heartbeat is providing some security that elephants are just not swapped or counted twice. But of course, this is not tamper-proof, because you could record a heartbeat and rerun it. Then, of course, you have the device, as Walid has explained. The device will be another part of the tamper-proofness. So you need to record the heartbeat and have the device in order to tamper, to forge a living elephant. So I think this is not tamper-proof, but it is already quite a high barrier. Maybe, Walid, do you see it the same way?
I think providing, getting a sensor that can record sufficient information that is tamper-proof, but crucially, that is non-intrusive to the animal. We do not want the animal to be in any distress. The challenge that today, the way we monitor elephants is basically by measuring the poop there is around the forest. So to get a DNA sample, however, that tells us some information. You can hide some cameras around the forest. That gives you some information, but there's no available information today that can give you a live feed about, is the animal alive and roughly their location. But these things, again, there are more questions than we have answers today. So that's why we're working with a major telecom operator to organize a hackathon in Q1, where we're going to invite companies, startups from all around the world to help solve the challenge of how can we have a sensor that is non-intrusive, that doesn't require a battery and doesn't have to be replaced every year, for example? B, that can monitor, for example, their heartbeat or any other thing to prove that they're unique, their location, and that the information is encrypted correctly, because you don't want their location information to fall into the hands of the poachers, for example. So these are all the challenges that we have to face. So these problems are going to be tackled both by the technology side, but what I did not mention is that we're addressing all these problems by setting up 12 working groups for our volunteers to join. One of them is a blockchain one of them is a sensor one, but I would say the most important one is the ethics working group. Is the ethics working group to make sure that what we do adheres to very strict codes of values that we believe in. And just to part of the conversation that's been happening, I want to clarify a point. Again, we're not prioritizing animals. If you're paying for a plumber to fix your pipes, you're not abusing that plumber, right? Here we're paying for an animal to remain alive and to roam and do whatever they do in their normal condition. Because today, they're not. Today, they're being hunted. 90% of the African forest elephants are gone. We can try all the tree hugging, all the kumbayas in the world. That's not going to fix it. It hasn't fixed it. And I love all the conservationist efforts, right? It's awesome, but the data says 90% has died. What will hopefully work is to say, this asset is worth $1.75 million. Keep it safe. Let it be free. Let it grow. Let it have babies, because that's the way we're going to be able to maintain and protect our forests. Why is this important? Let me give you an example. The Nile River, right? If Ethiopia is building this massive dam and Egypt is saying, you know what, we're going to bomb that dam if you build it because it's a threat to us. What they don't think about is that the forest that is being maintained by those elephants on the western part of Africa, the humidity of that forest is what's powering the airflows that carries the rain that supplies the Nile River. That forest disappears, Now river is gone. Problem is, us as humanity, we have this very short-termist approach. We're gonna bomb this, we're gonna bomb that, or whatever, right? We need to be a bit more clever. We need to think about how everything is interconnected. Unfortunately, up to now, the existing approaches have not worked. And I believe that by the work that Ralph has done in putting valuation to these magnificent creatures, that we can build a market that safeguards their right to live and their right to freedom.
Thank you, Walid. And I can see that your initiative is highly discussed in the chat of our Zoom meeting. I can see that, Julien, you have actually raised a couple of aspects on the technology around, not only on blockchain, but as well the tokenization system behind. I would like to give you a moment, the mic, to choose one of the questions that you had in order to dive a little bit deeper into either tokenization or the question that you just posted last in the chat, which is about the protection of the elephants and the improvement of carbon footprint profiles of companies. I'll give you the floor now.
Thank you. Now, I think Walid already answered the previous question. For me, one of the main risks with any kind of carbon credit system is that you cannot, reduce the energy level of some of the companies to actually decarbonize their industries. And if you only protect existing animals, it's super great. I love the idea, but you're not going to make any positive impact to the actual amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? So that's what I'm saying. I think we have to be very careful that we don't give companies that have the wrong behaviors an excuse somehow to move away from decarbonization. And I think that's what the carbon system today has done. And that's why I was emphasizing, if you would do it for the newborn elephants, at least you're kind of forcing the system to say, okay, every time we have a newborn, then we're going to remove some level of carbon from the atmosphere.
So thank you for your point, Julian. So what's interesting about the valuation that Ralph did on the elephants is that it also presumes the future benefits that elephant will bring through procreation. By this elephant being alive, it will help to create new generation of elephants that will create a certain value in terms of carbon capture and carbon sequestration. And then he took a discount factor on the net present value to achieve that valuation. But the challenge though where we're having is that, those populations are decreasing. They keep decreasing. So the first and foremost thing is we need to stop that decrease as fast as possible and to provide a safe environment for them to be able to grow and to have new babies effectively. And again, so just to clarify, this project is barely 2 months old. There's a lot of stuff, we're trying to learn and trying to get onto speed as fast as possible. And we are, and I'm grateful for the huge amount of volunteers that we're getting. But I could see a version where for every new elephant, that has come in, there's a bonus or something that is in, or a higher valuation or something along those lines. The mechanics of it, we will have to look at it completely. But this is a first stab at it. We want to welcome as much, constructive questions or feedback as much as possible, because as I said, this is a multidisciplinary approach to resolving this, and we need as many minds to help us achieve it. But coming back to your points about, firms, using this to continue that bad behavior, our solution is just part of the global solution, right? You need activist movements. You need the work, for example, that Sonja is doing. This has to be tackled from as many different angles as possible. I'm encouraged, though, by firms like I mentioned in the chat box, like Microsoft, who said that they want to become carbon negative, which is they want to pay back their debt to nature since their existence about all the carbon that they've been effectively producing, through their servers and so on. They're not interesting about saying we want to be carbon zero today. We want to pay back our debt. And I'm hoping many other firms are going to follow that leadership. And that's when our system will come into play for that. My hope, to be honest, is that we don't need my system anymore.
Yeah,
you
but
know,
what it
where
was, the problem behind those statements is that they assume the cost of 1 ton of carbon is $20–25, while really removing 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere is like $500 more, right? I don't think they would claim the same things if they really priced carbon at the right level. So again, that's part of having the right incentives in the system.
Correct. And the thing is, at the moment, different markets have different valuations about carbon. What is certain, though, is that the situation is getting more stark year by year as we're approaching, you know, the Paris climate change agreements, you know, a deadline date. That price of carbon is probably going to keep increasing, which is an unfortunate, but also it's a great incentive to protect those creatures to continue their carbon capture, carbon sequestration services. Because if you think about it, the Bill Gates Foundation is paying millions of money investment in technology that's here to capture carbon from the air. Why? We've got the best technology that exists in those living creatures today. Let's just put our money where it should be.
Okay, thank you. We have now 3 minutes left for the webinar, and we will close today differently with the final statement, and I will give now the floor to Renate. Walid and Sonja, you still have now the chance to give a final statement and to summarize your main point.
Exactly. Thank you very much for this lively discussion. That's clearly the Geneva Macrolabs community as we know it. So before we close, I would like to ask our speakers a 30-second statement. Sonja, would you like to go first?
Sure, Renate, thank you. So let me recap. Sustainability has moved from a nice to have to a need to do, and it's paramount for businesses to find profitable solutions for people and the planet. Strategies and leadership teams are well advised to consider their impact as they look for the sweet spot between the space of social shortfalls and the ecological overshoot. Impact valuation can then be used in an ongoing reality check and measure the true value and success.
Excellent, thank you. Walid, you have 30 seconds for your last statement.
10 seconds is fine, thank you. So today we are facing what's called an Anthropocene extinction, which is the first ever man-made extinction event. Now we want to deliver a message of hope. And basically it's to say, you're not powerless. Join our interdisciplinary movement to reimagine the carbon offsetting market to support a prosperous economy, thriving local communities, all in a regenerative nature. So join us, bring your constructive criticism, bring your ideas, the more the better. Looking forward to seeing as many of you.
Thank you, Walid. We are absolutely in the same boat regarding the project, and as that we had that already earlier this year in Davos, where we discussed the topic, and I look forward to following up on that. Thanks much, everybody. We will publish the recorded webinar later. You can find it on our YouTube channel. The link will be posted in the chat. Please join us again next week. Here's a quick outlook on our events to come. On the 2nd of December, we will talk about the future of work. We will have some distinguished speakers. One is from Bosch and one is from Deutsche Börse. On the 9th of December, we will talk about a hot topic, the world after the US election. I invite you already to join us. And on the 15th of December, we will have a special edition with ArtHub. And I saw Francesco is with us today, one of the co-founders of ArtHub, and we will have a live performance of an artist. If you want to become a member of the Geneva Macrolabs, please use the link that's posted in the chat. We would be happy to have you among our members. Also, please see the link to our YouTube channel. You find more information about the Geneva Macrolabs on our website. We just published some interesting research. It's a COVID-19 calculator that we received from the German Robert Koch Institute, and that enables public policymakers to assess different quarantine and testing strategies for their ability to reduce transmission. So please have a look at our website. It's published there. Wish you all a very good rest of the week. Stay healthy and see you next Wednesday. Goodbye for now.